He paid for the seat. He followed every rule. He stayed calm. So why did the airline try to remove him? Just because he didn't look the part? What happened next didn't just make headlines. It changed the system from the inside out. And when they found out who he really was, it was already too late. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Malcolm Ellison didn't like attention. Not the kind that came from flashing cameras or boardroom applause. What he liked was silence. The kind of silence you earn after building something from scratch. Something real. He sat in his sunlit home office in North Crest, California, sipping black coffee that had gone cold. Not because he forgot it, but because his mind had wandered. The skyline outside his window blinked with quiet promise, but Malcolm was somewhere else, half in the room, half in memory. He was packing for a trip to New York. Nothing unusual, just another flight, another meeting, another closed-door session with people who smiled too much and listened too little. But this trip, something sat heavier than usual in his chest. His suitcase was half open on the couch, shirts folded with the kind of precision you'd expect from someone who didn't believe in doing things twice. Malcolm glanced at his calendar. A quiet red dot marked the flight out to Fairbridge International. Aerovista Air, Flight AV307. Same route, same airline, same seat. 1A. He always picked 1A. Not because it was near the front or because of the legroom, but because it reminded him he'd earned his place. He didn't grow up thinking he'd ever sit in first class. He grew up hoping to keep the lights on. In the hallway, an old photograph hung beside the thermostat. His mother in her factory uniform, standing tall with grease-stained gloves and fire in her eyes. That photo reminded him of where he came from and who taught him what quiet dignity looked like. He turned back to his desk. The screen on his laptop glowed with a pending presentation for Airvista. His company, Axion Ethics, was about to finalize a multi-million-dollar deal with the airline, helping them build an AI-powered passenger trust system. They'd courted him for months. Boardroom meetings, fancy steak dinners, all the nodding and back-patting, and now they were days away from signing. All Malcolm had to do was show up, smile, and close the deal. He leaned back, folding his arms. Outside, a soft breeze nudged the blinds. Something about the trip didn't sit right. Maybe it was just exhaustion. Maybe it was the way people still looked at him, even after all these years. The way some security guards tensed when he walked into hotel lobbies. The way cab drivers double-checked the address when he said Executive Tower. Or maybe it was just the seat. 1A, always a test of who believed he belonged there. He pressed a palm against the center of his chest, not from pain, but to ground himself. "You're not fighting ghosts, Malcolm," he whispered. "You're walking into rooms they never expected you in." And that, in truth, was what unsettled him the most. Not that people questioned his place, but that no matter how many doors he opened, he still had to prove he had the right to walk through them. As the sun dipped a little lower and cast soft gold across the hardwood, Malcolm zipped his suitcase shut. He stood still for a moment, looking at the photo of his mother again. "Seat 1A, he muttered, shaking his head. "It's just a number, but some people still act like it's a throne." And deep down, he knew this flight would test more than his patience. It might test the very silence he'd carried his whole life, the silence that spoke louder than words, that he wore like armor in rooms that weren't built for him. He checked his boarding pass once more, slipped it into his jacket pocket, and took one last sip of cold coffee before heading out the door. The sun followed him quietly down the steps, like a witness to a story that hadn't quite begun, but was already starting to stir. Fairbridge International had that kind of Monday morning energy that you could feel in your bones. Tight schedules, distant announcements echoing from overhead speakers, and the constant rolling hum of luggage wheels crossing polished tile. Malcolm moved through the terminal without fanfare. He traveled light, always had. One black carry-on, a charcoal overcoat slung casually over his arm, and a mind already working through the week ahead. He paused briefly at the Aerovista Priority Lounge. The receptionist behind the counter gave him the kind of smile people give when they're trying to figure out if you really belong there. She scanned his member ID badge, glanced at the screen, then looked back up at him. "You're all set, Mr. Ellison," she said, voice polite but clipped. He gave a short nod and moved inside, walking past suited executives hunched over phones and a few travelers whispering about delayed flights. The lounge smelled faintly of lemon and leather, expensive, calculated comfort. 30 minutes later, he was standing at gate B6, boarding pass in hand, watching as flight AV307 began priority boarding. As the gate agent scanned his pass, there was no hesitation, no question. The screen blinked green. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Ellison." He stepped into the jet bridge with the calm of someone who'd done this 100 times. And he had. What he didn't expect was the look Tanya Blake gave him the moment he stepped into the cabin. She was standing by the front galley, checking something on a tablet. A smile flickered across her face, until she saw him turn toward seat 1A. Then the smile thinned, tightened, and vanished completely. "Sir," she said, stepping forward, "are you sure you're in the right section?" Malcolm stopped. There was no confusion in his eyes, no hesitation in his tone. "Yes," he replied, pulling out his phone. "Seat 1A. Booked 4 weeks ago. Priority Plus member." She barely glanced at the screen before nodding stiffly. "Of course. Please make yourself comfortable." He placed his briefcase neatly beneath the seat, slid into the soft leather cushion, and leaned back. He wasn't angry, not yet, but he felt it. That familiar shift in the air. That pause people take when they're trying to make sense of seeing a black man where they didn't expect one. Malcolm looked out the window, watching the tarmac bustle with movement. That was when he heard it, the rhythmic click of designer heels approaching. He turned his head as a woman entered the cabin, blonde, elegant, with oversized sunglasses perched on her head like a crown. Camille Prescott. She stopped at the edge of the row, lips pursed, eyes fixed on Malcolm as if he'd wandered into her living room uninvited. "This is my seat," she said flatly. Tanya reappeared immediately. "Ms. Prescott, your seat is 1B, just to the right." Camille didn't move. She crossed her arms. "I always sit in 1A every Monday. Ask anyone." Tanya hesitated. "Mr. Ellison is already seated in 1A. Camille turned to Malcolm, voice dropping into that particular tone, sharp, syrupy, and cold. "Perhaps you're confused, sir. Maybe you meant to board a different cabin." Malcolm didn't even blink. "No confusion," he said evenly. "This is my seat." The air seemed to stiffen. A businessman across the aisle shifted uncomfortably. Someone in row 2 glanced up from a paperback. Tanya's eyes flicked nervously between them. Camille leaned in slightly, her voice lower, but no less condescending. "Maybe it's best if we let the crew sort this out. I'm sure we can find you something more appropriate." Malcolm didn't speak for a moment. Then he looked up slowly, met her eyes. "I chose this seat for a reason. I paid for it. I'm not moving." That was when Tanya stepped away and spoke into her earpiece. Malcolm could hear just enough. Words like situation, priority passenger, and supervisor requested. Camille took her seat in 1B, but the tension didn't sit down with her. It hung in the air like smoke, curling its way into every glance, every breath. 2 minutes later, a man in his 40s entered the cabin, short-sleeved shirt, badge clipped to his belt, posture rigid. "Mr. Ellison," he said, voice polite but rehearsed. "My name's Ron Halbert. I'm the cabin supervisor for today's flight." Malcolm nodded. "We've had a request from one of our long-term flyers. Ms. Prescott usually occupies this seat." "That's not how assigned seating works," Malcolm replied, calm but firm. "Of course not. Of course," Ron said quickly. "It's just that sometimes expectations are not policies," Malcolm finished for him, "and I have no intention of giving up my seat for someone's expectation." Behind them, a phone camera clicked on. Malcolm saw it in the reflection of the window. Someone was recording. Ron shifted his weight. "We're simply trying to make everyone comfortable." "And what about mine?" Malcolm asked quietly. "Does that count?" Ron opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Camille sat with a faint smirk on her lips, like someone who already believed the outcome had been decided. But this time, Malcolm wasn't playing along. And outside, somewhere down the jet bridge, the quiet rumble of change had already begun to rise. The silence inside the cabin had started to change. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was dense, humming with something uncomfortable. Malcolm sat still, both feet flat on the floor, one hand resting lightly on his knee. He didn't move, but he could feel everything around him shift. The glances, the breath holding, the invisible question marks hanging over his presence. Tanya stood frozen a few steps behind Ron Halbert, arms tucked tightly in front of her as if she didn't know what to do with them. Her face had the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes, the kind that tried too hard to look neutral but couldn't hide its preference. Ron leaned in, lowering his voice just enough for Malcolm to hear, but loud enough for nearby passengers to catch fragments. "Mr. Ellison," he said with a practiced calm, "I'm going to ask one more time. Would you consider moving to another seat in first class? We have 3As available. Still premium, still quiet." Malcolm turned his head just slightly. "You're asking me to move so that she," he motioned with his chin toward Camille, "can have the seat she feels entitled to, even though it's not hers?" Ron blinked. He didn't answer right away. Tanya shifted beside him, pressing the tablet she carried tighter to her chest like a shield. "It's not about entitlement," Ron said. "It's about keeping the experience smooth. She's a frequent flyer. She's used to a certain environment." Malcolm exhaled slowly through his nose. "I booked this seat, paid for it. I'm also a Priority Plus member." Ron gave a polite nod that said nothing. "Of course, we appreciate your loyalty. But not enough to protect my seat," Malcolm said quietly. "Only enough to expect me to give it up." Across the aisle, a woman in a gray blazer watched closely. The man next to her subtly angled his phone camera. Behind them, a soft murmur rippled across the rows, quiet conversations laced with disbelief. Camille crossed one leg over the other and reached into her bag, pulling out a pair of sunglasses. She didn't need them. The cabin lights were soft, but she put them on anyway, as if to say she was above the scene entirely. "Some people are just difficult," she said out loud, not looking at anyone in particular. Malcolm heard her, of course, but he didn't look at her. He looked at Ron and said, "If you're going to remove me, do it now, but you'd better have a reason that'll hold up when this ends up on every screen in the country." That was the moment Tanya's face broke its neutral pose. She blinked hard, then shot a glance toward Ron. He hesitated, just for a breath. Then he reached for his radio and spoke into it. "Requesting security boarding," he said. "We may have a non-compliant passenger." The words hung in the air longer than they should have. Malcolm didn't move. He didn't argue. He leaned back into the seat, let his head rest lightly against the leather, and placed his phone down on the tray. Camera already rolling, recording everything. Tanya's hands were shaking now, just slightly. She turned to Camille and whispered something, barely audible. Camille smiled beneath her sunglasses. "I knew he wouldn't last." A couple of rows back, a man in his 20s muttered, "This is messed up." The woman beside him nudged his arm, whispered something, but neither of them looked away. Malcolm sat like a stone, not angry, not afraid, just still, because he'd been here before. Not on this plane, maybe, but in this moment, the one where being calm made people nervous and being seated made people uncomfortable. A stillness that always seemed to be mistaken for defiance. The announcement chimed overhead, distant and unrelated. "Final boarding call for flight ABR 307 to New York." Inside the cabin, though, the flight was already delayed. Not by weather, not by luggage, but by the invisible weight of an unspoken truth. Someone in 1A wasn't supposed to be there, and the people who thought that were about to find out why he was. They came in quiet, two airport security officers, walking side by side down the narrow aisle like they'd done it 1,000 times. They weren't rushed, but they weren't relaxed either. Their uniforms were crisp, shoes polished, faces unreadable. They didn't ask where the problem was. They already knew. Malcolm didn't look up at first. He could feel them before he saw them, their presence cutting through the cabin like a blade. Someone in the back whispered, "Here they come," and that's when the atmosphere turned from awkward to tense. The taller of the two stepped forward, pausing beside seat 1A. He cleared his throat. "Sir," he began, voice calm, rehearsed, "we've been asked to escort you off the aircraft." Malcolm looked up slowly. His phone, still on the tray, was angled perfectly, capturing the officer's face, Tanya standing just behind, and the faint reflection of Camille smirking in her sunglasses across the aisle. "On what grounds?" Malcolm asked, his tone steady, soft enough not to provoke, firm enough to demand an answer. The second officer, younger, shifted uncomfortably. "They said you're refusing to comply with crew instructions and causing a disturbance." "A disturbance?" Malcolm echoed, not laughing, not even smiling. "By sitting in the seat assigned to me?" The younger officer glanced at Ron, who stood near the galley, arms crossed, face stiff. "I've said nothing disrespectful," Malcolm continued. "I haven't raised my voice. I haven't touched anyone. I've simply declined to surrender a seat I legally paid for." No one moved. Even Camille's smile faded a little. Tanya looked like she was trying to disappear into her uniform. "Look," the older officer said, lowering his voice, "we're just here to resolve this quietly. The crew can't begin the flight until this issue is settled. We're asking you, sir, to step off so we can de-escalate." "So your solution," Malcolm said, "is to remove the one person following the rules for the comfort of someone who isn't." The younger officer opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Malcolm looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached down, picked up his phone, and hit the lock button. The screen went black. The recording had stopped, but not before capturing everything. He stood up slowly, shoulders back, not with reluctance but with intention. Every move deliberate. Every eye in that cabin followed him. Ron didn't say a word. Tanya looked away. Camille took off her sunglasses, finally realizing the moment wasn't going how she thought it would. Before leaving, Malcolm turned, looked at Ron, and said clearly, "You didn't just remove a passenger. You removed your solution." Then he stepped into the aisle, picked up his bag, and walked toward the exit. As he reached the front, an older woman in the second row leaned slightly into the aisle. She had silver braids pulled neatly into a bun and wore a faded navy cardigan with a pin that read, "Still We Rise." Malcolm paused when he saw her. She smiled, eyes full of quiet fire. "Don't let them shift your peace," she said gently. He nodded once. "Thank you." And then he was gone. The cabin stayed silent long after the door closed. Not the kind of silence that follows relief, but the kind that lingers after something irreversible has happened. Camille adjusted her scarf. Tanya rubbed the back of her neck. Ron didn't move. In the back, someone whispered, "He didn't yell. He didn't curse. He just left." And somewhere in the terminal, Malcolm sat down on a bench near gate B8, placed his phone beside him, and looked out the window at the runway. His seat was gone, but the story wasn't. Not even close. Malcolm sat still for a long time. The buzz of travelers passing through Fairbridge's Terminal C filled the air around him, but it was all just background noise. He wasn't angry, not in the way people often expected a black man to be after being publicly humiliated. No raised voice, no slammed fists, just clarity. The kind of clarity that doesn't hit you all at once, but creeps in slow, quiet like a tide. He reached for his phone, thumbed it awake, and opened the video file. 4 minutes and 22 seconds. Steady framing, clear audio, faces visible, words unmistakable. He watched it once, beginning to end. He didn't flinch when he saw Tanya glance at Camille. Didn't blink when Ron muttered expectations. He just watched himself, sitting still, calm, doing nothing wrong, and getting walked off a plane for making someone else uncomfortable. He looked around. No one was watching him now. A couple nearby travelers sipped coffee, glued to their tablets. 2 teens scrolled through videos, heads low, earbuds in. He opened Twitter. He typed without overthinking. The words came easy. "Removed from my assigned seat in first class because someone else usually sits there. I paid. I arrived early. I followed every rule. But I didn't belong. Apparently. Here's what happened." He attached the video. Hit post. Nothing dramatic. No hashtags. No bold declarations. Just truth. He closed the app, leaned back against the cool bench, and exhaled. The world would decide what to do with it. 10 minutes later, his phone buzzed. Then buzzed again. Then it didn't stop buzzing. He watched the view count climb. 14,000. Then 37,000. By the time he reached the Skylink lounge, it had passed 100,000. He opened the thread. Comments were pouring in. He was calm. They were not. This happens every day. We just finally have it on camera. That man didn't disturb the peace. He disturbed their comfort. Somewhere in the noise, a name popped up. Camille Prescott. Someone had recognized her face. Screenshots from old magazine features surfaced. A thread appeared within the hour, highlighting past incidents, lawsuits, complaints, online reviews that painted a very different picture from the polished one she showed on TV. Malcolm's phone rang. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. Mr. Ellison, this is Harper Ray from Stateside Tribune. We're covering the video. Do you have a moment? He glanced around. The lounge was quiet, but eyes were beginning to drift in his direction now. I don't think this is about me, he said simply. I think it's about what people believe first class looks like, and what happens when it doesn't match their picture. Harper was quiet for a second. Then, would you go on record with that? Malcolm paused, watching his reflection in the glass. Yeah, he said. Go ahead and print it. And just like that, what had started as one man refusing to be erased from a seat turned into something else. Something louder. Not anger, not revenge. Just the kind of truth that won't sit still anymore. And outside on the runway, Flight AV-307 finally took off. Without him. Dolores Shaw sat at her kitchen table in Queens, holding her morning cup of tea in both hands like it might steady her heart. Her old laptop, slow and stubborn, sat open in front of her, and on its screen, paused at the 2:17 mark, was Malcolm Ellison, still seated, still calm. She'd watched the video 4 times now, not because she didn't believe what happened, but because she recognized something in his stillness, something she hadn't seen in years. Her phone buzzed beside the teacup. A reporter from a local station wanted to talk. I'm not a witness, she said into the phone. I was just there. Yes, ma'am, the young woman replied. But your voice in the video, what you said to him, it's being shared everywhere. Dolores closed her eyes. She hadn't meant to speak. Not really. She'd just seen too many moments like that to keep silent. Too many buses, too many counter stools, too many doors that weren't supposed to be walked through. Well, she said after a beat, if it helps the truth settle in, I guess I can say a few things. The video had lit a fire. By that afternoon, the top headline on every major news site read, Passenger removed from first class sparks outrage and national conversation. Networks ran the footage in loops. Commentators called it deeply unsettling and a quiet kind of discrimination that's harder to name, but easier to see now. Aerovista released a brief statement. We are reviewing an incident on Flight AV-307 involving a seating dispute. We value all passengers and take any concerns seriously. That was it. Nothing more. But Malcolm had already seen enough. He opened his inbox and clicked on a message marked confidential. The sender's name was unfamiliar, but the subject line froze him in place. Not the first time. Read this. The email came from someone using the alias J. Attached was a single PDF, an internal Aerovista report, partially redacted, listing prior complaints about 2 crew members, Tanya Blake and Ron Halbert. 10 incidents, over 3 years. 9 of the passengers were people of color. Most cases were resolved with reassigned seats or vouchers. No disciplinary action ever taken. A note in the margin of one page caught Malcolm's eye. Camille Prescott, known priority request for seat 1A, referred to verbal arrangement par crew. Verbal arrangement. So it had been happening. Quietly, consistently, and not just to him. He sat back, breath slow, heart steady, the way it always was when his mind began to sharpen. He didn't want to sue, not yet. He wanted the story told right. Not about money, not about revenge, about visibility. He tapped out a quick reply. Can we talk? I need you to confirm what you sent, and I need names. Then he called his legal team. We're not making demands, he told them. We're holding up a mirror. Meanwhile, Camille Prescott sat in her uptown office, watching her public image fracture in real time. Her wellness brand, Presendia Life, had gone dark on social media. Emails poured in from partners, sponsors, and furious customers. She stared at a video loop of herself on the plane, playing silently on a blog. Her sunglasses, her words, her smirk. Overlaid were captions added by someone online. Entitlement in 4K. This seat isn't yours, it's ours now. She closed the laptop with more force than she meant to, then threw it across the room. Her assistant peeked through the door. "Camille, get PR on the phone," she snapped. "Now!" But it was too late. The story had slipped out of her hands and landed in the hands of a man who didn't yell, didn't threaten, didn't need to prove anything. He just stayed seated, and the world noticed. Malcolm wasn't a man who rushed decisions. He didn't operate off impulse or emotion. His strength had always been seeing patterns where others saw noise. But the more he looked at what was unfolding, the more he realized this wasn't about a single seed or a single flight. It was a pattern, and it had been playing out quietly over time, right beneath everyone's feet. He sat at his kitchen table back in North Crest, the same place where he'd packed his suitcase just a few days before. Only now he wasn't preparing for a business trip. He was preparing for a reckoning. His laptop screen was split between two files. On the left, the internal Aerovista report that Jay had leaked. On the right, a folder he'd started compiling himself. Passenger stories, tweets, emails, screenshots from public forums. He saw names, dates, flight numbers, people of color who had been moved, questioned, denied upgrades despite being eligible. Most of the stories were subtle, easy to explain away. But Malcolm saw the rhythm, the consistency. He clicked on a video link from a woman named Lydia, who had posted her own experience. "They said my dress was inappropriate for first class," she said into the camera. "But the woman in the seat next to me was wearing the same thing. I got moved, she got champagne." Malcolm closed the video and rubbed his eyes. Then his phone lit up with a new email from a sender named Janelle Ortega. He opened it. "Mr. Ellison, I used to work for Aerovista. Tanya Blake and Brad Halbert had a standing arrangement with Camille Prescott. She never booked 1A. It was just expected to be hers. I know this because I was told to block it off more than once. No paper trail, just quiet nods. I'm willing to go on record." "Name the time." Malcolm sat back in his chair, let out a slow breath. The picture was getting sharper. He called Dolores. "I'm sitting on more evidence than I thought I'd find," he said, "and I'm not sure what to do next." Her voice on the other end was steady, just like it had been on the plane. "What do you want, Malcolm?" He paused. "I want to break the cycle." "Then you already know what to do." "But if I push this too far," he hesitated, "I could lose contracts. My company's got 2 federal proposals on the table. You know how these things go. I become the divisive one, and suddenly I'm not collaborative." There was a silence on the line. Then Dolores spoke again. "Let me tell you something an old friend once told me," she said. "If your silence helps them sleep at night, ask yourself, are you really resting?" That landed like a stone in his chest. Later that night, Malcolm opened his calendar and scheduled a press conference. He didn't call it a press conference, though. He called it what it was. A public conversation. He invited 3 former passengers who had emailed him with their own stories. He booked a modest community center in Brooklyn, far from the polished marble of corporate boardrooms. No suits, no sponsors. Just a camera, some folding chairs, and the truth. Meanwhile, on the other side of the country, Aerovista's PR team was in full containment mode. Tanya and Brad had been put on administrative review. Camille Prescott had been asked to step back from public engagements. Internally, no one said the word racism. They called it a perception challenge. But perception wasn't the problem anymore. It was proof. And Malcolm had plenty. At 2:13 a.m., just before shutting down for the night, he added one last slide to the presentation he was building. At the top, in bold letters, it read, "How many times does it have to happen before it's not a mistake?" Then he closed the laptop and sat in the dark a little longer. Not planning revenge. Planning accountability. The folding chairs weren't comfortable. The lighting was uneven. And the sound system, if Malcolm was being honest, buzzed a little too much in the left speaker. But none of that mattered. Not today. What mattered was that the room was full. Journalists, community leaders, activists, a few curious locals who'd seen the flyer on social media, and 3 former Aerovista passengers who had flown quietly under the radar. Until now. Malcolm stood at the front, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened. He wasn't there to perform. He was there to present the pattern. "This isn't about a seat," he said, voice clear but low. "It never was. It's about expectation, about entitlement, about what happens when people think you don't belong, and how often the system quietly agrees with them." Behind him, a projector screen flickered to life. The first slide showed a timeline. 10 incidents, 3 years, same airline, same crew, same outcome. He turned back to the room. "They call it a misunderstanding, a mix-up, a scheduling error. But here's the thing about patterns. They don't care about spin. They just repeat." He stepped aside and let the others speak. Janelle Ortega, former Aerovista gate agent, took the mic. She looked nervous, hands trembling slightly. "I was told to leave seat 1A open," she said, more than once. No one ever said her name out loud, but we all knew who it was for. The room didn't erupt. It didn't need to. The silence that followed her statement was heavier than any applause. Next, a young teacher named Marcus stood. He shared how he was moved mid-boarding after someone else requested a window seat. "I booked that seat for a reason," he said. "My legs don't fit in the aisle." I explained that. Didn't matter. They gave it to someone else. White guy. Didn't even say thank you. The final speaker was an older woman named Vivian. She didn't raise her voice once. "They smiled when they moved me," she said. "Told me they'd upgraded me to a quieter section." I looked around. Only one other person looked like me. He got moved too. When it was Malcolm's turn again, he didn't read from notes. He just looked out at the room and said, "They didn't make a mistake. They built a pattern." Within an hour, clips of the event flooded social media. One line in particular took off. "I didn't disturb the peace. I disturbed their comfort." It was shared by civil rights groups, educators, even a few celebrities. The video of Malcolm standing at the podium hit 1 million views before midnight. And that's when Aerovista snapped. The company issued a defensive statement, accusing Malcolm of exaggeration and attempting to gain public leverage during an ongoing business negotiation. It didn't land well. By morning, 2 senators had called for a federal inquiry. A transportation watchdog group demanded Aerovista's internal complaint records, and a university ethics board rescinded an award previously granted to the airline's executive leadership. Malcolm didn't respond immediately. He knew the power of silence when used right. But something unexpected happened that afternoon. He got a call from a number marked private. "Mr. Ellison," the voice said, deep and careful. "My name's Devin Marsh. I'm a board member at Aerovista. What you've uncovered, it's bigger than a seat, bigger than one crew." Malcolm waited. "There are people on the inside who don't want this exposed. You're closer to something they've kept buried for years." "And what is it exactly?" Malcolm asked. There was a pause. "Ownership," the voice continued, quieter now. "You may have more power in this company than you realize. I suggest you look into your investment portfolio, specifically your acquisition firms. There are pieces of Aerovista you're connected to." Malcolm's hand froze over his laptop. "You're saying I own part of the airline that tried to remove me?" "I'm saying," Devin replied, "you might own enough to change it if you choose to use it." Click. The line went dead, and Malcolm just sat there. Not because he didn't believe it, but because he did. Malcolm didn't sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen counter, a lukewarm mug of tea untouched beside him, scrolling through documents he hadn't looked at in months. Acquisition memos, investment summaries, partnership chains. And then he saw it. Ellison Holdings, his private firm, designed years ago to manage ethical technology investments, had quietly diversified under his finance team's direction. Through a network of shell companies and silent partners, they'd acquired minority stakes in several transportation entities, including Aerovista. Not a controlling stake, not yet, but significant, 18.4%. His name wasn't on any of the public papers, but the trail was there, quiet, legal, and powerful. He closed his laptop and sat still, his fingers drumming against the edge of the counter. This wasn't just a discrimination case now. This was personal, structural, and very, very public. He called Elise, his longtime COO at Axion Ethics. "I need to know if Aerovista's board is aware of our holdings," he said. There was silence on the other end, then a slow exhale. "They might suspect, but they don't know how close you are." He nodded to himself. "Then we keep it that way. For now." "You thinking lawsuit?" Elise asked. "No," Malcolm said. "I'm thinking leverage." Later that morning, as the sun climbed into a pale blue sky over North Crest, Malcolm drafted a letter, not to Aerovista, to its shareholders. It wasn't angry, it wasn't emotional, it was a mirror. Your brand depends on trust. Your passengers depend on fairness. Your silence in the face of consistent, recorded bias is no longer neutral. It is complicity. I urge you to choose the kind of future your customers and your employees can believe in. He signed it, scanned it, and scheduled it for release the following day. But before that letter ever reached inboxes, Aerovista fired the first public shot. A senior PR executive appeared on a business news channel with a forced smile and a calm voice. "We believe in resolving conflicts directly and privately," she said. "Unfortunately, one of our partners has chosen to escalate a seeding misunderstanding into a larger coordinated media campaign. We hope to return to business, as usual, very soon." That phrase, business as usual. Malcolm leaned back, the words echoing louder than they should. He looked out the window, then picked up his phone and made a call to the same community center in Brooklyn where he'd held the public conversation days earlier. "I need the room again," he said, "and I need more chairs this time." Because business as usual, that was never going to fly again. They thought they could frame it as noise, as a man having a moment, a viral spiral that would fizzle once the public lost interest. But Malcolm didn't move like a moment. He moved like a shift, and the shift was gaining weight. By noon the next day, his open letter had made its way across industry forums, investor circles, and 2 national morning shows. One anchor read it live on air, pausing just before the final line. "Silence is not the absence of noise. It is the absence of justice." That quote, simple as it was, turned into a headline. Then a hashtag. Seat justice. But the real fire started when Tanya Blake stepped in front of a camera. In an exclusive interview with a conservative podcast host, she attempted to reclaim the narrative. Her hair was done, her blazer pressed, but her hands betrayed her, constantly twisting her wedding ring, fingers fidgeting, as if the truth itched beneath her skin. "I was doing my job," she said. "Some passengers just create an uncomfortable environment for others. I followed protocol." The host leaned in, voice oily with sympathy. "So you felt unsafe?" She hesitated, just a beat too long. "Not unsafe," she said, eyes darting. "But there was tension, and in my role, I'm trained to de-escalate before things get out of hand." "And he got out of hand?" She looked down. "He didn't cooperate with a reasonable request." The clip spread like wildfire. Within an hour, side-by-side comparisons of her interview and Malcolm's cabin footage flooded TikTok, Twitter, and daytime television. The tone deafness, the contradiction, the smirk. More importantly, the discrepancy. One account was calm, documented, and consistent. The other, shaky, self-preserving. And then came the leak. An anonymous post on a well-known aviation forum included a screenshot of a Slack message from Aerovista's internal team chat. From a senior flight manager. "Make sure Tanya's statement doesn't conflict with the footage. Keep messaging clean. This can't become a racial optics thing." Too late. The optics weren't the problem anymore. The evidence was. By that evening, dozens of former employees had begun speaking up. Gate agents, stewards, even a retired pilot, sharing stories under the new tag number "I worked there." One particularly gut-wrenching post came from a baggage handler named Reggie, who wrote, "I saw it all the time. Passengers moved, downgraded, delayed, all because someone felt off about them. You know what off looked like? Brown Aerovista scrambled. Their legal team pushed out a second press release by midnight, distancing themselves from Tanya's interview. But the damage had already soaked through. And Malcolm? He said nothing. Not online. Not in the press. Instead, he sat in a modest conference room with 3 members of his legal team and Elise, his COO. The walls were bare. A whiteboard behind them was filled with bullet points and underlines in red marker. Across the table, Elise tapped her pen against a printed document. "You have two choices," she said. "You can sue them. You'll win. Or, Malcolm interrupted, "I can change them." "You're talking about a full corporate reset," one of the lawyers said. "That's not activism. That's control." Malcolm met his eyes. "I'm not trying to shame them," he said. "I'm giving them a way out, one that comes with accountability." He pulled out a single-page draft, a proposal, the seat equity agreement. It outlined a complete overhaul of Aerovista's internal systems, bias training, transparent hiring, passenger protection policies, anonymous reporting tools, all monitored by an independent equity board. "And if they say no?" Elise asked. Malcolm slid a folder across the table. Inside, stock certificates, voting rights, and a letter addressed to Aerovista's board of directors. "I own 18% of their company," he said. "If they refuse to fix it, I'll take it." The room went still. Elise leaned back, watching him. "This isn't just about a seat anymore." "No," Malcolm said, quiet but clear. "It's about who decides who gets to sit and who gets removed." He stood, straightened his shirt, and reached for the folder. "I'm going to deliver this myself." And as he walked out, past the windows glowing with city light, the world behind him buzzed with headlines. But Malcolm wasn't chasing noise. He was chasing structure, and structure was about to shift. The boardroom at Aerovista's Atlanta headquarters wasn't designed for discomfort. Everything in it had been chosen for polish. Oak panels, frosted glass, ergonomic chairs that whispered money. But that morning, despite the luxury, the room felt tense. Like the walls themselves knew something was about to change. At the far end of the table sat Gregory Nance, CEO. He hadn't slept much. His tie was too tight. His knuckles were pale from clenching a pen that hadn't written anything in the last hour. Across from him, in the seat usually reserved for high-level investors, sat Malcolm Ellison. No entourage. No briefcase full of legal threats. Just a slim black folder and the kind of presence that made silence stretch long and heavy. "Mr. Ellison," Gregory began, voice smooth but thin, "we regret what happened, deeply. It was never our intent to—" Malcolm raised a hand. "Not rude, just final." "I'm not here for an apology," he said. "I'm here for accountability." He opened the folder, laid 3 documents out neatly on the table. The first was a summary of every recorded instance of bias linked to Aerovista over the last 5 years. The second, a breakdown of current shareholder sentiment, many of whom had now aligned publicly with Malcolm. The third, a proposal, the seat equity agreement. "This isn't a demand," Malcolm said. "It's a correction." Gregory glanced at the paperwork, then at his legal advisor, who leaned over, whispering something Malcolm couldn't hear. It didn't matter. He knew the expression. Caution wrapped in ego. "You must understand," Gregory said after a pause, "implementing this kind of change, overnight restructuring, independent audits, staff terminations, this isn't as simple as signing a document." "I never said it was simple," Malcolm replied. "I said it was necessary." Another executive cleared her throat. "There's concern this sets a precedent, one we may not be able to control." Malcolm's gaze held steady. "You lost control the moment you let bias speak louder than policy. What I'm offering isn't chaos. It's a blueprint." Gregory's voice dropped lower, his tone tightening. "You're threatening to burn down a company you partially own." "No," Malcolm said, leaning forward just enough. "I'm threatening to rebuild one that clearly wasn't working." He slid one more sheet across the table. It listed the names of key individuals, Tanya Blake, Brad Halbert, and 2 internal managers who had tried to suppress prior complaints. "I want them gone, not punished, just removed. Quietly, if you prefer, but permanently." Gregory stared at the list. His jaw tightened. "And if we don't agree?" he asked. Malcolm didn't blink. "Then I rally my shares, call for a vote, and take your seats out from under you, just like you tried to do to me." The room went cold. No one spoke for a long time. Finally, Gregory sat back, rubbed his temples, and looked around the room at his own board. Faces that had once been allies, now unsure, calculating. Malcolm stood, collected the folder, and said, "You don't have to like it. You just have to choose." As he walked to the door, one of the junior board members, quiet until now, spoke up softly. "What happens if we say yes?" Malcolm paused, turned halfway back. "Then you become the first airline in the country with a policy not just against discrimination, but with proof it means something." Then he left. Behind him, the oak-paneled room didn't feel polished anymore. It felt shaken. And outside, in the hallway, a young employee with a clipboard, barely out of college, watched him pass and whispered under his breath, "He just walked in like he already owned the place." Because in a way, he did. Camille Prescott stood in front of her full-length mirror, still in her penthouse suite above Midtown. She stared hard at her reflection, not in search of flaws, but of control. The lines beneath her eyes had deepened overnight. Her phone buzzed on the marble countertop behind her for the 7th time that hour. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She'd spent years curating her image. Wellness expert, polished public figure, daughter of a prominent judge. But none of that mattered now. Not when her name was trending for all the wrong reasons. Her assistant stepped in, timid. "Camille, the media team says we need a statement by noon." Camille didn't turn around. She applied a final stroke of mascara, then said flatly, "Tell them I'll write it myself." Back at Aerovista headquarters, Gregory Nance stood before his executive team with a printout of Malcolm's proposal in one hand and a report in the other. A report detailing just how deep Malcolm's influence now ran. Elise Marshall, one of Malcolm's longtime associates and COO of Action Ethics, had quietly been buying additional Aerovista shares over the past 48 hours. 3% here, 2% there. It added up. "He owns 26% now," Gregory muttered, barely above a whisper. "And if he gets 2 more major investors to side with him, we're not in control anymore." A silence fell over the table. "We have a PR crisis," the communications director chimed in. "Our diversity initiatives look like window dressing. Tanya's interview made it worse. And Camille? She's nuclear right now." Gregory threw the printouts on the table. "We can't fire her. She'll sue." "Let her," the legal counsel said deadpan. "Malcolm has receipts. Every policy, every incident, every blocked seat, it's all documented." The room was cracking. Meanwhile, Malcolm stood in a small community tech center in South Brooklyn, speaking to a room packed with students, journalists, and everyday passengers who'd seen the video and recognized themselves in it. "We all know this isn't about just one airline," he said, his sleeves rolled again, voice steady and deliberate. "It's about systems, about who's trusted, who's expected, and who's not." He wasn't reading from notes. He didn't need to. The problem isn't that the seat was taken. It's that someone decided who deserved to sit there. And no matter how calm I stayed, no matter how much I paid, my presence was still seen as a problem. The room was silent except for one clap, then 2, then the whole place stood up. That night his speech aired on 3 major networks, and at 11:42 p.m., Camille's carefully crafted apology post went live. "I deeply regret that my personal expectations on Flight AV307 caused discomfort for other passengers. While I did not intend harm, I understand that impact matters more than intent. I am committed to learning, growing, and doing better." The internet saw right through it. She regrets getting caught. Not harm, just inconvenience to her public image. Where was this energy on the plane? By sunrise, Camille's brand, Presendia Life, had been dropped by 3 retailers. A video of her reaction inside the office, throwing a phone across the room, leaked within the hour. And Aerovista? They called for an emergency board vote. At 8 a.m. sharp, Malcolm was formally invited to attend. He arrived alone. No press, no speeches, just a slim leather folder and the kind of steady gaze that made people sit up straighter without knowing why. As he stepped into the boardroom, Gregory looked up from his seat at the head of the table. "Mr. Ellison," he said with forced calm, "thank you for coming." Malcolm nodded once. "I'm not here for the seat anymore," he said. "I'm here for the structure that made losing it so easy." He laid the folder on the table. "This is what accountability looks like." And just like that, the vote began. The conference room felt colder than usual. Not from the air conditioning, but from what hung in the air. Uncertainty. Everyone at the table had dressed for control, but their eyes told the truth. Control was slipping. Malcolm didn't take the seat offered to him at the end. He walked halfway down the side of the long table and sat in a chair no one had expected him to choose, right in the middle. It wasn't a power move. It was a message. He belonged in the center now. Gregory cleared his throat. We're here today to vote on the proposed equity agreement submitted by Mr. Ellison. Before we begin, Malcolm cut in, calm but clear. No speeches. Let's just vote. It was the kind of interruption no one had dared before in that room, but no one stopped him. Not anymore. The corporate secretary began the roll call. One by one, names were called and voices responded. Yes. No. Abstain. The early numbers were close. Elise, watching from a remote screen, kept her expression still. She already knew the count, but this wasn't about numbers. It was about public record. Halfway through the list, the balance began to tip. A former skeptic, board member Vance Tomlinson, leaned forward, paused, then said, yes. A quiet gasp moved through the room. He held 4%. Then came another. Yes, and another. By the time they reached the final 3 voters, the result was clear. The motion passed, 61% in favor. Malcolm didn't smile. He simply looked down at the document in front of him, lifted a pen from the table, and signed his name at the bottom of the page. Effective immediately, he said, handing the signed agreement to the secretary. Aerovista Airlines will implement a 90-day corporate restructuring initiative, audited independently, reported publicly, and managed by a newly formed equity oversight board. Gregory leaned back, lips pressed tight. You've made your point, Mr. Ellison. No, Malcolm replied. The passengers made it. I'm just carrying it into the building. The next few minutes passed in formalities, motions acknowledged, records sealed, legal language recited. But something deeper had shifted. Tanya Blake was formally removed from duty. Ron Halbert was placed under internal review, pending immediate administrative leave. And Camille? Her special privileges, partnerships, and loyalty tier status were revoked indefinitely. But the real twist came not in the removal, but in what followed. Malcolm stood again, holding a final envelope. I'm not done, he said. He opened the flap and slid out a thin document. I'm increasing my stake to 30% as of this morning, a controlling interest. Gregory's mouth parted, but no sound came out. I won't run your company, Malcolm continued, but I will hold it accountable, publicly, consistently, and without exception. The new board charter requires equity review for all future promotions, contracts, and incident reports. He paused. No more blind spots. And with that, he walked out. No handshake, no nod of approval, just the soft sound of quiet footsteps echoing through a hallway that had never known what to do with his presence, until now. Outside, in the press-filled lobby, a reporter called out, Mr. Ellison, what does this mean for Aerovista's future? He didn't break stride. He just said without turning back, it means everyone gets a seat. And behind the glass walls of that towering building, the men and women who once dismissed him sat staring at an empty chair, the one he no longer needed to occupy, because now the room itself had changed. The air outside Aerovista's headquarters was thick with noise. Reporters shouting questions, cameras clicking, pedestrians pausing just to watch it all unfold. But Malcolm moved through it the way he always had, quietly, without flinching. He didn't need a podium. The statement had already been made. Across social media, the story was exploding. But this time, it wasn't just the video. It wasn't just the incident. It was everything that came after. The vote, the restructuring, the shift. A tweet from a civil rights organization summed it up perfectly. He didn't storm the gates. He walked through the front door and rewrote the rules. Back in Brooklyn, Dolores Shaw sat at her kitchen table, watching the news play out on the tiny television wedged between cookbooks and a ceramic jar of tea bags. The reporter's voice was full of urgency, but her eyes were calm. She knew. She'd seen this kind of shift once before, decades ago, on buses, at lunch counters, and now at 30,000 feet in the sky. She picked up her landline and dialed a number from memory. Malcolm, she said when he answered. You did it. There was a pause on the other end. No, he said quietly. We're just getting started. By evening, the ripples had reached places even Malcolm didn't expect. A letter from the Department of Transportation landed in Aerovista's inbox, requesting a formal review of all past passenger complaints going back 5 years. A congressional subcommittee announced hearings on equity in commercial air travel. And then came the email from the White House. Elise read it twice before calling Malcolm. They want you in D.C. next week, she said. Closed-door session, transportation reform. They're listening, Malcolm. He exhaled but didn't celebrate. Not yet. Instead, he stood at the edge of a rooftop overlooking downtown North Crest. The city glowed below, office windows like stars blinking back. Beside him stood Janelle Ortega, the former gate agent who had helped spark the investigation. You ever think it would get this far? She asked, arms crossed against the evening chill. Malcolm looked out at the skyline. Number. But I hoped, she nodded. I'm proud of what you did. What we all did. He smiled soft. You know what's wild? For years I thought the seat was the goal. First class, priority, legroom. But it wasn't. Janelle looked at him. Then what was it? He turned, eyes steady. The table. Because it had never been about the seat. The seat was just where the pattern showed itself. The table, that's where decisions were made. Where policy was written. Where silence either grew or got broken. The next morning, Camille Prescott posted a second video. Less polished, no makeup. Just her sitting on a balcony, trying to speak through the noise she had once commanded so easily. I can't undo what I said or how I acted, she began. But I can't pretend it wasn't part of a larger problem. I benefited from a system that made people like me comfortable and people like him invisible. I saw it. I just didn't care. It was too late for image repair. Her brand had already lost 3 major distribution contracts. Lawsuits from former employees were underway. She'd become a symbol, for the wrong reasons. But maybe, Malcolm thought, even symbols could change. That afternoon, Aerovista quietly changed the name of its internal conduct policy. It was no longer called Passenger Conflict Resolution. It was now titled The 1A Standard. In fine print beneath the heading, it read, Inspired by the events of Flight ARV 307. Every passenger has a right to dignity, no matter their seat. Malcolm didn't post about it. He didn't need to. He just printed a copy, folded it neatly, and placed it on the shelf beside an old photograph of his mother. Because in a world where the rules had always been written by others, he had written something new. Not for himself, but for everyone still waiting for their seat. The day Tanya Blake received her termination notice, she didn't cry. She read the subject line, Final HR Determination, Policy Violation, Termination of Employment, with a blank expression, sitting at her kitchen counter, surrounded by silence. No calls, no messages. The airline had cut her off completely. She scrolled through her inbox. Meetings canceled, access revoked. Her ID badge would stop working by the next morning. Just like that, 12 years of climbing had ended with one decision. A decision she'd convinced herself was standard procedure. But deep down, she knew. It wasn't just the removal of a passenger. It was the refusal to question the quiet voice in her head. The one that had made her see certain people as disruptions before they'd said a word. She got up and wandered to the window. Outside, the world moved on. A delivery truck beeped. A child chased a soccer ball down the sidewalk. Nothing looked different, but everything had changed. At that same moment, Brad Halbert, her former supervisor, sat across from an internal review panel in Aerovista's legal department. The mood was colder, less symbolic, more surgical. The chair of the panel flipped through a thick binder of reports. You approved preferential seating for Ms. Camille Prescott on 14 separate flights, she said, with no documentation and outside our automated system. Brad looked tired. His tie was askew. His voice had lost all its polish. I was told she was a high-value flyer, he muttered. By whom? He hesitated. Look, he said, dropping the act. Every airline makes exceptions. We just didn't write it down. That's all. The panel didn't respond. They didn't need to. They weren't interested in his excuses. Only the record. And the record was damning. Within an hour, Brad was escorted out of the building. No security team. No scene. Just the echo of his footsteps and a door that shut harder than it needed to. Elsewhere, in a bright auditorium at Northcrest University, Malcolm stood behind a lectern, speaking not to executives or shareholders, but to a group of students, mostly first-generation college kids, mostly young, mostly hungry to believe the world could still be changed. He wasn't dressed up, no tie, no jacket, just a light sweater and the calm cadence of someone who knew exactly who he was. I didn't want to fight, he told them. I wanted to fly. I wanted to mind my business and get from one place to another. But sometimes, silence gets heavy. He stepped out from behind the lectern and paced slowly. They didn't yell at me, didn't curse, didn't shove. They smiled, asked questions, suggested, requested, pressured, removed. He looked up, eyes sharp. And that's how it happens. Quiet injustice, sanitized exclusion. It doesn't always wear a hood. Sometimes it wears a name tag and calls itself policy. The room didn't clap, not right away. They just listened. And then, finally, someone in the back stood, then another, and another, because they knew he wasn't just talking about a plane. He was talking about boardrooms, classrooms, job interviews, lobbies, sidewalks, supermarkets, voting booths, anywhere someone had ever been told, without words, you don't belong here. Back in Atlanta, the new board chair of Aerovista signed the final authorization for the Seat Equity Oversight Committee. Malcolm would co-chair alongside two outside appointees. The committee's mission was simple: to ensure dignity is not determined by zip code, skin tone, or status. It wasn't a perfect fix, but it was a start. And that night, as Malcolm sat alone in his apartment, watching the city glow beneath him, he opened a letter that had been sitting on his desk all week. It was handwritten. The envelope had no return address. Inside was a single sentence: "You sat still so the rest of us could stand." He read it twice, then quietly placed it on the mantel beside the others. Because the reckoning had happened. But the rebuilding, that was just beginning. The ceremony wasn't televised. There were no red carpets, no orchestras, no limos lined up outside. Just a row of folding chairs beneath the soft morning light at Terminal D, Gate 7, inside Fairbridge International Airport. That gate, where it all began, now bore a new plaque mounted beside the check-in counter. Bronze, clean, unassuming. This seat is for those who were told they didn't belong, in honor of the stand taken by Malcolm Ellison on Flight AV307, and beside it, cordoned off with a velvet rope and a small gold sign, was Seat 1A, empty, reserved. Not for executives, not for influencers, but for everyday heroes, teachers, volunteers, activists, students. Each week, a new name would be announced. Each name chosen for their impact in their community, not their wallet. The first honoree was a middle school janitor named Harold Dawson, 34 years of service, never missed a day. When they called his name, he cried, not because he was flying first class, but because someone finally saw him. Malcolm didn't speak at the unveiling. He sat in the second row, watching, listening. Afterward, a young girl approached him, maybe 12, brown skin, purple backpack, notebook in her arms like it was something sacred. "Are you the man from the video?" she asked. He smiled. "I might be." She hesitated, then handed him the notebook. Inside, a drawing, crayon and pencil, a picture of him sitting in Seat 1A, surrounded by people of every shade, age, and size. She'd written one line underneath: "He didn't move, so we could." Malcolm swallowed hard and nodded, his voice a little quieter when he said, "Thank you. That means more than you know." She beamed, then ran off to join her mother. Later that afternoon, he boarded a plane. Not a V307, not a symbolic flight, just a normal commercial trip to Washington, D.C., the kind where you sit down, buckle in, and hope to make it on time. He didn't pick 1A this time. He chose a window seat in the middle row, somewhere between strangers, just one more passenger among many. And when a young black man passed him on the way to the front cabin, new suit, nervous glance, boarding pass crumpled in his fist, Malcolm gave him a nod. The man paused, surprised, then nodded back with a small, grateful smile. No words exchanged, but the message landed. You belong here. As the plane rolled down the runway and lifted into the clouds, Malcolm rested his head against the window and closed his eyes. Not from exhaustion, but from peace. For once, there was nothing to brace for. He didn't have to prove anything. He didn't have to fight for space. He'd already done that. For himself. For everyone. And now the seat stayed open. Not as a wound, but as a promise. A seat that changed the world by refusing to be given away. What started with one man and one seat revealed something much bigger. That dignity shouldn't be a privilege, and silence shouldn't be the price of peace. So let us ask you, have you ever been made to feel like you didn't belong? Even when you did everything right? Drop your story in the comments. Your voice might be the one that helps change the next policy, the next company, maybe even the world. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe. Because next time, the seat might be different, but the lesson will still matter. We've got more stories that uncover truth, restore justice, and remind us all. Sometimes sitting still is the most powerful thing you can do.